One more time, good afternoon. This is Bethany Yeager with KEB. We're impressed that so many of you are joining at 1 o'clock on a Friday, so thank you very much for that. We know it's not the typical WIOA Wednesday webinar time slot, so we appreciate your flexibility in accommodating this time slot on a Friday afternoon. This is the third webinar that we've had, or maybe fourth even, of the Governor's Guidelines. And each time that we have one of these webinars about the Governor's Guidelines, it means they've changed significantly. And so today's webinar is important to highlight the changes that are going to affect your MOU negotiations that start as early as next month. Today we're going to have 5 parts, and then we'll
Your microphone has been turned on.
Tips. And after each part, we will have we'll pause for some question and answers. And if we run out of time between those sections to answer any of the questions or any of your questions, please know that we'll do our best to respond to them in writing afterwards. And you can help us do that by writing all of your questions in the chat box to the left, as some of you are so used to doing now with these Wednesday webinar formats. But to those of you who are new, we use the chat box to record all the questions and make sure that we can answer them after the fact if we have to. Or if there are any questions that we can't answer today, then we'll certainly get back to you all and circulate the responses. So first we're going to talk about the background, make sure everyone remembers why the Governor's Guidelines are important. And then we'll talk about the significant changes, and we're going to split those into the MOU negotiations and then the cost negotiations. And then we'll introduce some new forms. Although they're not final and ready for you today, we're going to at least show you some of the concepts that are changing in the MOU template and the budget spreadsheets. And then we'll make sure you all are very clear on the timelines that are applicable for the program year that you are going to negotiate starting next month. So first, we just want to remind everyone, even if you have been familiar with the Governor's Guidelines in the past year, it doesn't hurt to remind us about why they're important and why they're a resource for going forward. So we want to cover that. The purpose of the Governor's Guidelines has not changed since the original version was issued a year ago, but it does matter because A, it's required in the law that the governor issue these guidelines for negotiating MOUs and costs of the local service delivery system, as well as the comprehensive one-stop centers. The second, the guidelines are designed to support the integration and better alignment of services of all of the required programs under WIOA. And then third, each required partner has to contribute its proportionate share of the costs. So there's a lot of detail that goes into that, and these guidelines hopefully provide steps and resources for you to do that. And also some standards for how it should work, and as well as some just basic principles of making sure that it's a fair process. So this is just a quick reminder that we issued them a year ago. It seems like forever ago, but it was a year ago exactly that the original version came out. But then, as you all remember, the federal government delayed the effective date of the infrastructure funding, so it did not apply for the last program year. And so we issued a revision 1 in March 2016, providing alternative timelines and some alternative steps for negotiation because those infrastructure costs were not going to be applicable after we thought they were originally. And then this revision is being issued because the final rules were issued, and so a lot actually changed under the final rules and affected the Governor's Guidelines to the point that the Governor's Guidelines didn't have to be completely rewritten, but some sections are totally new and different. So we want to make sure that you look at those. And last year the guidance was do as you did under WIA, which is the former law. That does not apply this year. WIOA is in full effect, and it's not going to fly to do what you did under WIA when you start your negotiations in January. So these are the sections of the Governor's Guidelines, just so you know where to look for which part they're cover the local negotiations of MOUs, the negotiations of the costs, then that is split into two parts. One is the infrastructure costs of the comprehensive one-stop center, and the other is the shared service delivery costs that that are required to operate provide services throughout the entire area. We're going to talk more specifically about those, of course, in this webinar. And then timelines. So if you need guidelines for what's due when, you just know that there's a page in the governor's guidelines that covers that. And then any reporting requirements, particularly providing a draft budget and also a report of outcomes to let everyone know how your negotiations ended up, whether you agreed or not. That's spelled out in the governor's guidelines. There's also an appeals process if the state funding mechanism is required, which we'll talk about, then you can appeal that. Then the timelines and templates are provided. The glossary is there, and there are some new terms in the glossary, so you probably will want to have that handy. And then other resources just to help provide the guidance you need in order to do this effectively. In many ways, as we said, program year 2016, which is the same as state fiscal year 2017, was a practice year because those infrastructure funding wasn't effective yet. But we gained a lot of insight by going through the negotiations this past program year. And a state-level team, as you know, did review every MOU that was submitted, and that review process identified that many of the changes required depended on the new governor's guidelines that reflected the final rule. So a lot of those changes were pushed off into the next program year. And although the MOUs by law are good for up to 3 years, because the final rules changed so much, particularly regarding service delivery and costs, that we required as part of the state level review process that all MOUs be renegotiated starting in January, so that the new MOUs are completely new MOUs are effective on July 1, 2017. So after that, after you negotiate them and they become effective July 1, 2017, then they will be good for or effective for up to 3 years. But that's, of course, up to local discretion. You can negotiate them more frequently if you want, but they have to be negotiated at least every 3 years. So when you negotiate them July 1, 2017, they'll be good through 2020 if that's what your local area decides to do. Okay, now we'll start to get a little more specific about what the revisions are of the what we'll call for short Revision 2 of the governor's guidelines. They, of course, all the changes reflect the final rules, and we add citations every place we could. We revised language about providing career services because that was a significant change in the final rules. Same as infrastructure costs. That section in the final rules was almost completely rewritten, and so we had to reflect that in the governor's guidelines, Revision 2. And then there are new language that we'll talk about in this webinar about how required partners can meet their cost obligations under state infrastructure funding and under the infrastructure funding as well as the local service delivery system costs. And then we did revise the timelines again, both because it's no longer the do as you did under WIA, and also because we learned a lot from the last process. We kind of adjusted some time periods to allow more time for the negotiation process. And then the MOU template has been revised. So has the budget spreadsheet, and we'll go through a little bit of that. And then we made as many clarifications as we could that were minor, but hopefully make this a little bit easier to follow. We're going to go through them one by one, but before we do that, are there any questions before we highlight the most significant changes of Revision 2? Okay, we will move on to highlight the most significant revisions. The first major change emphasizes a commitment to integration, and this is part of the goals section of the governor's guidelines on the very first page. And the integration emphasis among includes sharing the customer data information, closely planning and coordinating services, training frontline staff about other required programs.
Your microphone has been
strategically
turned
planning
on.
to meet regional economies, and leveraging program resources for the mutual benefit of customers and required programs. So all that is to say, it's no longer the year of transition. We are trying to get past that. It's time to get real and fulfill the principle of WIOA that focuses on service integration. So the point of having that in that section of the governor's guidelines is just to say, hey, this is an emphasis and an important part of this year going forward. The second major change involves the delivery of career services. And remember that the final rules clarify career services. There's essentially 23 services that qualify as career services, and they're split into three types. One is basic career services that applies to anyone who walks through the OneStop Center. For example, being determined eligible for a program. The second type of career service is individualized, and that's tailored for each participant. It's a little bit more intensive to the point where they get an individual attention, for example, an individual employment plan. And the third is follow-up services. So the final rules also identify three ways in which the required partners can deliver those career services. So one is through staff that is available on site to provide those services. The second is someone else's program staff who's cross-trained to provide your services on site. And then the third is via technology, and we'll talk a lot more about what that looks like. But the final rules clarify that those are available to provide career services. Illinois is electing to specify more detailed requirements for making services available by technology, what is called direct linkage. And that the purpose is to ensure a high level quality of service regardless of whether you're in person or via technology. So let me talk a little bit more about what those additional requirements are. This is a little more of a reminder, a background, that the definition of direct linkage is described in the final rules and was modified a little bit. The direct linkage through the program staff has to be made available if needed and demanded by the customer. Those are the key words that are new clarifications in the final rule. It basically acknowledges that not all customers are ready for a direct interaction with a staff member when they walk in the door, and that differs from the final rule because the draft rule because that required a direct linkage to be made available at all times. So this recognizes that even though they walk in the door, they might not need that technology the minute they walk in the door, but it has to be made available if they do. The program staff can also arrange to meet with the customer at a later date and time. So this is also a little bit different from the draft rules, which prohibited that from happening. This time, in the final rules, you can have program staff say, I'm not available at this moment, but I can meet you later this afternoon or tomorrow at X time and set that up with the customer. The final rules also provide a little more clarification about, what direct linkage means for providing a phone number, website, or pamphlet. You can do that as long as it's not the only information offered to the customer. So direct linkage via technology has to remain available to the customer at all times, but it can include providing a phone number. That also is different from the draft rules. So this is the third major change in the governor's guidelines, and it's defined more fully in Appendix Item 4 of the governor's guidelines. But Illinois is establishing additional requirements to provide via direct linkage technology. So that means that it's allowable under the final rules to provide career services via direct linkage, but Illinois wants to be more specific about what that looks like. So, for example, by phone, that means that you have to have a specific dedicated phone number. And the phone coverage has to be available at all normal business hours on all normal business days. And then there has to be some mode of leaving a voicemail or some way of getting a message if a customer tries to access the service via technology at one time, but it's not available at that exact moment. So all that is just trying to be more specific so that we know what it means to say you're going to provide services by phone. The second part of that requirement is what it means to provide services by video. So, for example, you have to have high-speed internet capability. You can't not have that and provide services by video. There has to be a dedicated computer-enabled communication access. Basically, they have to be able to talk to each other between two locations. And it has to be real-time, video and audio. And then there has to be backup capability or some kind of scheduling capability if the video is unavailable at the time of contact. So the examples we've used in the past have been Skype or Zoom or GoToMeeting. Those are fine as long as you have some way to let the customer know how to access them if it's not available at the exact moment they want it. So those are not spelled out in the final rule. These are additional requirements that Illinois is adding, and they're new content in the governor's guidelines. And again, see Appendix Item 4, page 62 for the summary of those requirements. The second additional direct linkage requirement is putting a little more definition into what means a reasonable period of time. And Illinois defines that as immediate on-demand access is the norm. But if it's not available at that exact moment in time that a customer needs the service, then as long as you contact, as long as you follow up with them within 24 business hours after they make initial contact, then that still can qualify as a reasonable period of time. So, for example, if the center, if a customer tried to access the center services at 4 p.m. on a Friday, but no one was available at that time, they could message and get the information they needed in order to know how to stay in contact with the one-stop center. Then the expectation is that a follow-up would happen within 24 business hours, meaning 4 p.m. Monday. So someone tried to access the service at 4 p.m. Friday, as long as they get a follow-up by 4 p.m. Monday, that would still satisfy the reasonable period of time requirement. And the last additional requirement for direct linkage, providing services via direct linkage in Illinois, is that the program staff who is responsible for responding via technology, A, should be trained and have the capacity to do so, and B, should have a normal responsibility as part of their jobs to provide direct linkage. We're just trying to prevent someone who is unaware of how to work the technology or that isn't used to providing it, being behind the computer or not knowing how to work Skype. It should be part of their training, and they should be very capable in doing so. So lastly, for all three of these additional requirements that Illinois puts on direct linkage technology, all of the methods, whichever one you choose, has to be accessible to individuals with disabilities. That's a given. Okay, one-stop operators are the fourth major change in the Governor's Guidelines Revision 2. And just a reminder, one-stop operators have to be in place by July 1, 2017, and they have to be competitively procured at least once every 4 years after that. So the final rules define the one-stop operator role, and the Governor's Guidelines add 3 additional points that are new or are at least emphasized. Number 1 is the MOU has to describe the role of the competitively procured one-stop operator. In the past, in the last MOU cycle, the role of the one-stop operator was not yet fully described in many local areas. This next year, it has to be. So, for example, one of the roles that's allowable by law is to coordinate service providers across the one-stop system or coordinate service delivery throughout the multi-center area if there are multiple comprehensive one-stop centers. And OneStop operators can also provide services within the center. So whatever those roles are decided by locally, they have to be spelled out in the MOU. The second is that it has to comply with requirements specified in the final rules and state policy. And that state policy has not yet been issued. It's being worked on by a multifaceted group. And the timeline is so that it will be issued early in 2017, as early as possible, because we realize that there is a time frame for competitively procuring your one-stop operators. The third is new, in hopes of helping required programs provide their services in a way that is feasible. So the new section of the Governor's Guidelines related to one-stop operators says the Local Workforce Innovation Board Chair, the LWIB Chair, can designate the one-stop operator as a resource to provide staff for cross-training to provide services on behalf of the local one-stop partners. So that is new, and if this action is taken, then the MOU has to describe the basis on which each partner's contribution toward the cost of one-stop operator staff available for cross-training will be determined. So that's a long way of saying that you have to describe it in the MOU, and if cross-trained staff are provided and on behalf of your program provide services, then there's going to be some offset of cost to that partner, and that has to be spelled out in the MOU as well as the budget. And we'll talk more about that in the last section of the webinar. This is the fifth major change of the Governor's Guidelines Revision 2. The timelines have been adjusted, again, based on insight from the last MOU negotiation process and the remediation process. We expanded the negotiation period from 90 days to 105 days. And so that means when negotiations start around January 1 or soon after, you have until April 15th, 2017 to negotiate your MOUs. And then on the April 15th, that's when the report of outcomes and a draft budget are due. The second change in the timeline is that the remediation period was 45 days. It's now going to be 30 days. And that's basically because the remediation period in the last cycle really accomplished the goals and helped avoid impasse in less than 45 days. 30 days is still feasible for the partners to address it, and the whole purpose is to address any outstanding issues as soon as possible, all to avoid impasse. And then if at impasse, there is an appeals process to the interagency work group first, and then to the Illinois Workforce Innovation Board, or the IWIB, the State Workforce Development Board. And that impasse process is spelled out more fully in the Governor's Guidelines. The sixth major change is the last part for this section of the webinar, but it's to clarify the role of the state-level team in the remediation period. So the state-level teams that helped local areas who did not agree last time around did in fact help avoid impasse in every circumstance. So there were a handful of local areas that could not agree at the end of last year's negotiation period. State-level teams comprised of all the core partners were engaged and then worked with the local areas to resolve all issues, and that worked. So if the new part of the Governor's Guidelines this year is that if one partner is holding up the process based on, say, a minor change or some change that's rather unreasonable, then the state-level team can assign a specific cost contribution to that partner if it helps avoid impasse. So that's just a new little thing that it prevents one partner from causing an entire local area to go into impasse. As long as the state-level team can have some direction, give some direction to that partner to make the local area come into agreement, then that's what this is entitled to. That's what this is set up to do. So that ends our first section that is focused on the MOU negotiation process. Are there any questions about that process before we get into the negotiation of costs?
Bethany, there was one question in the chat pod. Is direct linkage via video required?
It's not required. You can use phone as long as it doesn't go to an answering service that doesn't get a response within 24 hours. Phone is an acceptable version of direct linkage as long as you can reach a real person in a reasonable amount of time. Okay, we don't see any other questions coming in. Anyone by phone have a question before we move on? I understand if we're putting you to sleep on a 1 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, but thanks for bearing with us. Everyone's favorite topic of infrastructure costs and local system costs. Before we get into it, though, I want to offer a few reminders specific to
Your microphone has been turned on.
One-Stop Center costs versus local system costs. So infrastructure costs, as you remember, are the non-personnel costs. It's considered the operations of the comprehensive one-stop center. Every local area has to have one comprehensive one-stop center, at least, and these infrastructure costs are what it costs to operate that specific physical center. So, for example, a lease, a facility cost, any kind of telecommunications for technology, or any signage for marketing. Those all qualify as infrastructure costs to operate the comprehensive one-stop center. On the right-hand of the side are local system costs. These are everything else. It's not infrastructure costs, but they are every other cost that's essential for service delivery and shared services throughout the local area. So system means entire local area. Infrastructure cost means one physical center. So a local system cost example is an intake process or a needs assessment for a customer, or local board functions is another example of a systems cost. Joint staff training. The whole purpose of the local system cost is to emphasize integration of services, anything that prioritizes integration of services, and joint staff training is one of those best examples of that. But the last point about the local system costs, as a reminder, is that they can consist of whatever the local area agrees on. So if all the local partners agree that it's a cost that's essential for the delivery of services throughout the local area, then that's fine. It's up to local discretion. Okay, I also want to do some more reminders about infrastructure costs because there are two mechanisms, as you remember. One is the local funding mechanism for infrastructure costs. The second is the state funding mechanism. So first, let me talk about the local funding mechanism. Just a reminder, there's way more flexibility under the local funding mechanism. So as long as local partners agree on how to split costs, then they can do that, and that's the local funding mechanism. There's also no statutory caps on the partner contributions. So when partners make contributions to the comprehensive one-stop center operating costs, then they can contribute the amount that local partners agree to. That's different than under the state funding mechanisms, which places caps or like maximizes the amount that the partners can contribute towards the one-stop center. I'll explain more about that in the next slide, but the other is that under the local funding mechanism, you can decide how you want to allocate those costs among all the required partners. In the governor's guidelines, it still says the full-time equivalent, or FTE, is the preferred methodology of allocating costs among all the required partners, but it's not the only way. You can choose alternative ways as long as all the partners agree to what that cost allocation methodology is. The new part under the local funding mechanism is that the final rules clarify 3 types of contributions that the core partners and the required partners can use to contribute to the infrastructure costs of the comprehensive one-stop. You can use cash, non-cash, or third-party in-kind contributions. So we're going to explain those a little more deeply in the next slide, because non-cash does not equal in-kind under the final rule language. So again, remember, this is the local infrastructure funding mechanism. It's going to be different for the local system service delivery system costs. Let me first talk about the infrastructure funding mechanism when all local partners agree under the local funding mechanism. You can use cash, which is self-explanatory, which can include an interagency transfer between required partners. Non-cash and third-party in-kind contributions, they can seem similar because they both cover the operating costs to operate the one-stop center. For example, you can donate space or equipment or technology, but it depends on who's contributing it. So if a required partner that is providing services in the comprehensive one-stop center provides technology, say computers for the resource room, that would offset its contribution towards the operating costs of the comprehensive one-stop center. If a third party, let's say a county, donates space, so space in the building for the comprehensive one-stop center to operate, then that would be a third party in kind. So as long as that means the third party obviously indicates someone who is not a required partner under WIOA. So for example, the county. So that's the difference between the two. Either way, whichever one, non-cash or third party in kind, if either one of those is used to contribute to the infrastructure costs to operate the comprehensive one-stop center, then you still have to meet 3 criteria. This did not change in the governor's guidelines, but I'm going to highlight it. 1, if the value of whatever is being contributed has to be agreed upon by all local partners. 2, it has to offset the cash contribution that partner would have paid otherwise. And then 3, the value has to be fairly, fair market value, I guess, valued consistent with it's called 2 CFR Part 200.306, but it's just the I'm drawing a blank on the name of the administrative rules. I'll provide that link to you. I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank. It's late on Friday afternoon, let me tell you. So those 3 things still have to happen in order for the non-cash and the third-party in-kind to be accepted and acceptable for offsetting cash contributions. This is the first major change in the governor's guidelines then for infrastructure cost negotiations relate to the FTE commitments. And the change is that the required partner FTE commitments will be based on demand. Required partners this year were to commit a number of FTEs to the system. And this year then they were supposed to start documenting if that's the right number of FTEs or what's the demand for their services and how does that reflect the number of FTEs they should commit the next program year. So that's what number 1 and 2 are saying on this slide. You have to use evidence of what the demand is in order to make your FTE commitments. And then at the bottom line, in red, it says, while discouraged, other cost allocation methods may be used as long as all the partners agree. Oh, there it is, the Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements for Federal Rural Boards. As long as everyone agrees and it complies with the Uniform Administrative Requirements, then it's acceptable. Okay, so we are going to talk about a change to the infrastructure cost section, but before I do that, I want to talk about the state funding mechanism. So we talked about the local funding mechanism. That's when all local partners agree on how to allocate the cost to operate the comprehensive one-stop center. The state funding mechanism is when the partners cannot agree, and it is considered a last resort. There is no flexibility, and so we want this slide to send the message that state funding mechanism is not desirable. It could essentially result in less money available to operate the comprehensive one-stop center because the partners are capped, and they also have fewer ways they can contribute, because under the state funding mechanism, partners can only contribute cash, not in kind and not personnel. So there's fewer options, and more and less money available under the state funding mechanism. And also, the state funding mechanism is only available as a last resort to certified comprehensive one-stop centers. So any comprehensive one-stop center that does not reach certification would not be eligible to receive funding under the state funding mechanism. Even though it's a limited, smaller amount than would otherwise be available, it's still not available to those who are not certified. And the last one is also less desirable because under the state funding mechanism, if that applies to your local area, then the partners have to accept whatever the governor decides is the infrastructure cost budget for the local area. So I'm going to talk about that in a second because that's new under the final rules. So this is the second major change to the section about negotiating infrastructure costs. So it just restates that the state funding mechanism will be used only as a last resort if the local partners fail to reach agreement. And the second part is that the LWIB, the Local Workforce Innovation Board, and the local partners, if they can't agree, then you lose local control of the partner contributions. You can't decide what your partners are going the partners cannot decide what they're going to contribute because instead the governor, literally the governor is written into the final rules as deciding what each partner contributes for its proportionate share of the operating cost of the comprehensive one-stop center. The governor will literally set a budget for your local area and you have no choice but to pay the amount the governor decides. So that's why it's considered an incentive to agree so that you avoid being told what you have to pay by the governor. And the governor is the governor's guidelines. The revision 2 reflects that the governor is involved when local impasse occurs. So that when impasse occurs, if after the remediation period, that 30-day remediation period, the partners still can't agree and an impasse is declared, then the local boards have to submit these things on the slide: the local plan, the proposed one-stop center budget, and the reason for disagreement, the cost allocation methodology used, whether it was FTEs or some alternative method, the amounts that each partner was allocated to pay, and then the proportionate share made, whether it was cash or non-cash or in kind. And then a list of any of the issues that are outstanding. And especially if they were outside of the cost negotiations, there's some other reason that they couldn't agree, then that would have to be documented and submitted all to the governor. And then the governor basically sets a new budget, or accepts the local version, or sets a new budget. So you can read all about that in many, many pages of the final rule. That citation is at the bottom of the slide. The fourth major change to the section on negotiating infrastructure costs for the comprehensive one-stop centers is describing how the governor considers or what the governor considers in order to set the local budgets. They look at the size, the location, the local area demographics, cost factors of comprehensive one-stop centers that are in a cohort. So there's a lot of factors and weights that are described in the final rules, and that's how the local budget is set if the governor doesn't accept your version. So that's reflected in the final rules on page 11. So I'll pause here real quick. That was the infrastructure cost center changes. Then we're going to get into the shared local system costs, which again are the service delivery costs for the entire local area. But before I do, I think there's a question. Infrastructure costs are non-personnel costs. And Personnel also, we did receive confirmation from the Department of Labor that personnel cannot be used as a non-cash contribution. So it was a little bit of a change from last year, our interpretation last year, but we did receive clarification and confirmation that personnel cannot be used to satisfy the infrastructure cost of a partner. Any other questions before I move into the local service delivery system costs? Okay, we'll start out with a reminder, 2 reminders, and then I'll tell you about the change in the governor's guidelines to the local system cost section. Just a reminder, so all required partners have to share in the local system delivery system costs. All required partners don't have a choice. They have to contribute towards it. And the costs that they share are determined locally. So you decide what you're going to share for delivery system costs. You can use cash, non-cash, and third-party in-kind contributions for your contribution toward local system costs. And again, the priority is for costs that promote integration, streamline service delivery, or improve outcomes. So remember, that's local board functions or joint staff training, anything that promotes integration. There are also, I should note that there are examples of what qualify as local system costs on page 69 of the governor's guidelines. It's appendix item 7. So it provides examples of local system costs. And here are some examples also on this slide. The cost to support local board functions, say you could contribute towards board staff salaries or board meeting costs or audit costs or data gathering. The costs that promote integration, some examples are the joint training, which I've said, the customer satisfaction surveys that are required, business services, receptionists, or resource room materials. So anything that local partners agree on can be considered local system costs that are allocated to all the partners. And this is just slightly different. It's a similar table, but slightly different because the last table that showed cash, non-cash, and third-party in-kind was for infrastructure costs. That's, remember, operating costs for the comprehensive one-stop center. This is for the system costs, so these examples are a little different. But so I'm going to give you one example. A required partner could contribute, they would need to contribute $5,000, let's say. That's what's allocated towards the local system costs. So instead of paying the $5,000 in cash, the local partner can provide a non-cash contribution of joint training or a customer satisfaction survey to promote service integration. So the 3 things that would have to happen in order for that to be accepted. 1, all the local partners have to agree on the $5,000 non-cash contribution. 2, the joint training and customer satisfaction survey, the value of that would have to offset the $5,000 that the partner otherwise would have had to pay in cash. And 3, the joint training and customer satisfaction survey, the amount of $5,000 would have to be fairly valued, and everyone would have to agree on that. So that is actually the last slide in this section about negotiating costs. Are there any questions about that before I move on to introducing the new forms and templates as part of the governor's guidelines? We do see someone typing in the chat box, so we'll give it a second. Renee, I see your question. Renee's question is whether the one-stop operator cost is a shared cost. It is, but when you say shared costs, there are two different kinds of shared costs. Infrastructure is one kind, which is the operating cost. The other kind is the local service delivery system cost. So I need to clarify and confirm before I get back to you about which one it is, because I just need to confirm before I provide the response, and we'll get back to you with the Q&A after this. Anyone else on the phone before we move on to the forms and templates? Okay. This is the fourth section out of 5, so just hang in there. We're almost done. The MOU template is required to be used, and that's the same as the last version of the governor's guidelines, so you still have to use the MOU template, but we did revise it, hopefully in a way that's user-friendly. One, it requires content that demonstrates a commitment to integration. As I said earlier, last year was kind of a test year and considered a transition year. This year, the focus on service integration is real, and we're trying to make that as real as possible in many ways when the rubber hits the road. And so there are going to be new dot points that you'll see in the required content of the MOU that does require you to describe how, not just what, but how you will do certain things, especially how partners will commit to integration. We revised the parties to the MOU section. Hopefully that will be a little more user-friendly. The local service matrices were revised because of changes in the final rule. And the FTE calculation spreadsheet changed also to reflect some of the changes in the way you can provide services. And that also affected the MOU budget spreadsheet. So all of that was updated and revised, and we're going to go through some examples. So the first change of the MOU template is everyone's favorite, signatures. We did add a signature line for the individuals who are designated by the local board chair to either lead the MOU negotiations or lead annual budget negotiations. Sometimes they're the same person, but not always, because the person designated to lead the budget negotiations has to be determined to be impartial. We also revised the parties to the MOU. The last version required signatures on the first page and on the last few pages. We took that away. Now only one set of signatures is required on the very last pages. And the other thing, hopefully to make it easier as you're collecting all these various signatures, is that every partner has their own page for signing and indicating the authoritative person who is signing. So hopefully that will help in just the compilation of all the signatures as they come in. This is what the top of the MOU template looks like right now. You can see on the very top, the red arrow pointing to the top. Those are the two new areas for the individuals designated by the local board chair to sign and provide their email address for follow-up questions, particularly for during the remediation period. And the second bottom arrow shows where the parties to the MOU, that's what it looks like now. And again, hopefully it's just more user-friendly and trying to make it clearer, and hopefully the formatting will remain consistent, so it's just more consistent and doesn't move on you. At the bottom of the parties to the MOU section in the MOU template, there's now a new yes or no box that you can click for what we call situational partners. Some of those partners, they're considered required partners under the law, but they're not always offered in every single local area just because the demand is not there. So you would be able to check yes or no, and that way it would help reviewers know whether that signature should be obtained or not in that local area. And then you can add additional partners if there are any that are not considered required partners, but still partners of the One Stop Center that should be part of the MOU. second change to the MOU template involves the local service matrices, and that's because the final rule did split out and be more specific about the career services, the three different kinds, the basic, individualized, and follow-up. So the local service matrix now is split into those sections of career services, and the required partners will have to indicate which basic career services they provide, or which individualized career services they provide, and which services fit under their programs. We also reformatted the section to indicate how the required partners will provide those services. We call it the service delivery method. Will they provide it by partner staff who's on site, through cross-trained staff, or contractors, or direct linkage? So we revised that so that it would reflect all of those possibilities, particularly the cross-training. And this is what it looks like. It's just a simple table, hopefully, that is user-friendly. And the partners just provide, write which services they provide under each method. The third major change to the MOU template involves the costs and cost sharing of sections. So in the narrative part of the MOU, there are these three new requirements. So it's basically the part that will be written to explain the budget spreadsheet and each partner's FTE calculations, how that was determined, and whether cross-training is involved, whether what approaches they take and what, if there's an alternative methodology, it would all be explained in this section. And then the last one is just emphasizing something that was in the final rule, that everyone has to acknowledge that any agreement is contingent on the availability of federal funding for each required program. This is what the FTE calculations spreadsheet will look like, or some version of it. This is not the final version that you see on the screen. It's still in the final editing and testing stages, and it will be issued. The plan is to issue it in January with some more instructions for how to do that. But I wanted to put it on the slide so you could see the new types, new ways to show how you're going to meet your FTE commitments. For example, you can see number 1, 2, 3 on the left of the slide. It explains the headings on the top of the table. You can indicate which partners provide on-site FTEs to provide their services, which partner is contributing the cross-trained staff on-site, and then the total FTEs on-site. So you have off-site, who's doing the cross-training for whom, and and then the total. And then we'll also, let's see, there's also going to be another column that's not on the screen about providing services via direct linkage technology. But all of that is, like I said, going to be issued formally as a fillable version with instructions next month. Same for the budget spreadsheet. Last year, the directive was to do what you did under WIA, and we didn't penalize anyone if the partner's contributions at the bottom of the tab did not equal the total annual budget of the comprehensive one-stop center. So basically, you were given a pass if your budgets didn't balance. It's going to be different this year. All the partners' contributions have to sum up towards the total annual budget, where the long red arrow is. So the expectation is that you will cover all the operating costs of the infrastructure budget this year through partners' contributions. It should all add up. And then the bottom, the second arrow, just points that the cash, non-cash, and third-party in-kind, the language was updated in the spreadsheet so that it matched the final rules in the governor's guidelines. Because last year we did allow in-kind staffing as a possibility, that's gone away this year. This is just one more disclaimer that it's in the final stages and we'll get it to you next month. But the versions in the governor's guidelines are just pictures, and the fillable versions will be available and issued with some announcement when that happens. Okay, that's the last section. Before I remind you about the timelines, are there any questions?
Your microphone has been turned on.
I'm reading Pam Furlan's question, and she asked a question about, is the state reviewing which partners are required partners to the MOU? Because they have a local circumstance that caused some confusion about whether that partner was required or whether they provided services in that local area. The required partners to the MOU are spelled out in the law and the final rules, so that's what the MOU template reflects. It just goes down the line of the required partners. But you can also have some partners who are, as I said, required, but maybe situational, and the demand is not there so that the partner does not have to provide services in that local area. So that's what the yes-no boxes are for in the MOU template, Pam. And if it's outside of that, then that's probably a local question that I would have to get some help answering from some of the state partners, particularly for the program you're talking about. So if you want to send us a question offline, please feel free. Thanks, Pam. Okay, we'll move on to the last section for you. This is just reminding you of the timelines because sometimes it's hard to look at it unless you have how it all fits together. The timelines are spelled out in the governor's guidelines, but just a reminder, the MOU, there is the new 105-day negotiation period, so January 1 through April 15. And at the end, you have to submit an outcomes report and a preliminary budget. And then if you can't agree at that date, then a remediation period begins for 30 days. And if you still can't agree after 30 days, then it's considered an impasse with all those other ramifications. The shared costs on the right, so MOUs have to be negotiated every 3 years, shared costs have to be negotiated annually, and then amended to be included in the MOU on an annual basis. And then also in the final rules, there has to be a periodic reconciliation between what costs were allocated in the budget versus what actual costs ended up being. So there has to be some mechanism, and hopefully we'll all get more guidance on what that means, what periodic reconciliation means. Does it mean quarterly, monthly? We don't know. So right now, all we know is that periodic reconciliation is required between budgeted and actual. This is the timeline in one easy place. We've updated this from previous webinars so that it reflects this version, the revision 2 of the governor's guidelines, and it just kind of repeats what I just said. So everything starts January 1, April 15th is a major date, May 1st remediation starts, May 31st remediation ends, June 15th the governor makes the final determination for the local budgets, and then July 1 everything becomes effective. And if anything is reported at impasse, then everything that's reported to the federal agencies. Okay, then now we're just going to offer some tips to begin the MOU negotiations and cost negotiations. These are requirements for submitting the renegotiated MOUs. We at first started calling them tips, but we realized that tips could indicate optional, and these are not optional. These are actual requirements, and they are based on insights we learned during the state level review process the last cycle. One is in the MOU template, you have to respond to every dot point. If you don't respond to it, then it's considered missing content. The second is the final rule citations are there for a reason. We do hope you go check them and specifically address all the content that is required in the final rules. It's usually straightforward about what's required, and the final rules are a place to double check that. The third is that even if you don't have the details yet, provide as much detail as you can to demonstrate each required partner's commitment to integration. And even if you haven't been able to demonstrate it yet, say how you plan to do it in the next year. Again, if specifics aren't available yet, describe why, explain, and then describe the planned activities that will help you get there. I'm not going to read through all these, but these, and some of you have seen this before when we did a webinar introducing the final reports for the MOU review, state level review. These are the common themes that that were behind some of the required revisions. I'm going to cite one example. The MOU, the next one, this one coming up, has to describe the functions and the scope of work of the one-stop operator. That was often glanced over in last year's, partially because they hadn't been procured yet, but this year they have to be procured and they have to be described. Another resource that is going to be available to you, some of you have heard of this, some of you might not have yet, are the State Technical Assistance Teams. We're calling them STATs for short. It's a group that is being formed of all required partners, and particularly the core partners have a representative in each economic development region. So there's going to be one team, one STAT per economic development region. And the core partners are all represented, and then as required partners are needed, they'll be added. And so I'm going to describe 3 roles of the STAT so you can get an idea of how they could be a resource for you. The one is that the STATs, because they're state level, they're appointed by state level partners, they serve as an extension of the interagency work group. So for those of you who might not know, the interagency work group is, we call them the nuts and bolts group of state level program representatives under WIOA, and they are truly focused on implementing WIOA at every level. It includes core partners and required partners, and they have the authority to make program commitments, or they can make it happen through their normal chains of command. So we have the administrators who are integral to implementing WIOA for each program represented on this group. And so the STATs are, an extension of them. So they are going to help ensure that you comply with all the state goals and the federal goals. They're going to notify the interagency work group of any issues in your local area, or something that needs resolution at the state level. If you're stuck on something that local partners can't resolve but requires state level intervention, then they would be the liaison to you to do that. And they also are going to support the state level teams that do the remediation periods for any local areas that are having a trouble agreeing on their MOUs. Another way they're going to be a resource for you is that they might be more nimble and hopefully will respond in a really timely manner, because they are going to be trained. And when I say act independently to provide training to you, or to provide information to you, or provide support to you, we don't mean going rogue from the interagency work group or the state board, the IWIB. The intent is that the staffs are just equipped to provide you the information and respond to questions that you have in a quick fashion, so that when you initiate contact with them, or when they initiate contact with you, things can get resolved. And then if not, then state level partners are notified immediately so that they can resolve the issue as soon as possible. And the last role of the STATs, and hopefully as a resource for you, the whole intent is, again, to transition from nuts and bolts implementation to more true integration of services, so as intended by the law. So STATs are, at least at first, the intent is for STATs to serve as a vehicle for making that happen, to making integration a reality. So they know, and they're being trained on the expectation that all these STATs participate and collaborate as a team, and they communicate as a team and not as one individual partner. And they're going to talk to each other. They're going to share resources with each other so that they know if one issue happens in one area or one region, they might be able to help address a similar issue in another region. And they are being asked to make the stat work a priority so that when an issue does come up again, that it can be addressed just as soon as possible. Even though a lot of them have other responsibilities under their normal job duties, the expectation is that stat work is to be immediate. So to get a little more real about what that might look like, they could provide training to anyone. They could link local partners to resources, or if there are technical issues, just troubleshoot them. They will hopefully help ensure compliance with the guidelines. They might check up on you to say, have you convened your local partners around the table to talk about how you're going to allocate costs yet? And if it's, March and you haven't done that yet, you might get a little call from them to say, hey, it's time to get that going so that you can meet the April 15th deadline. So that's what we mean when we say monitoring progress in the MOU negotiations. Supporting the MOU remediation, again, those state-level teams, they'll partner with them so that they can maybe be dispatched to address a certain issue for a certain partner and work at the state level. And then just fielding any questions you have. Maybe you have an interpretation of something I've said today, or of the final rule, or of a state policy. You can run it past them. If they don't know, then they'll bring it up to the interagency work group's attention so that we can get some guidance out. So that's pretty much it. The resources that we always refer you to is the WIOA implementation portal. That link is provided on the site, on the slide. There are some password protected areas that are for working groups where working documents are, but there are a lot of resources that are not password protected. They're available to the public. The documents and updates, specifically where the governor's guidelines are saved and the templates are saved, you have access to that right now. There's also regional planning material that's also public that is very helpful in those activities. And then for any Title I specific, we're just letting you know that that e-policy manual is available at that link, and any Title I specific policies that could be helpful to you, then that's where they are located, and they'll be continued to be updated during the implementation phase. So that's the end of our presentation. I'm happy to answer any more questions now. Susan Flessner asked, how do you find out who is on your stat? We are training members January 10th, and we have a list of the members right now, but they're not exactly final yet. Some partners are still fine-tuning them. So as soon as everything is gelled and they're trained, we'll make an announcement. It's not going to be a secret who's on these stats. It's just not ready for prime time yet because things are still changing behind the scenes. But they're in-person training. They've had one webinar training already this month. They have an in-person training that's going to last all day on January 10th. So after that, we'll develop a formal plan to roll out the stats and introduce everyone, and there's talk of how to best to do that. So all of that is still being worked out. But Susan, it won't be a secret, I promise. Thank you for the kind words, Elwea 20. Well, I especially thank you all for putting up with, an hour and 15 minutes of webinar talking. Thank you for your time, and do you know how to contact us? If you don't, you can contact Christy Jones at KEB, and we'll be sure to follow up with an MOU FAQ as we did last year, and that'll be available on the portal and distributed to all the partners. But please let us know if you have any other questions that were not asked today. And thank you very much for your time and patience and energy on this Friday afternoon.